9 bodies, a shredded tent, footprints leading into a blizzard, barefoot, and a government that locked the files for 30 years. This is not a mystery. This is a cover-up. February 1959. Deep in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a search party arrives at a campsite that should have had 9 living, breathing people inside it. Instead, the tent is collapsed, slashed open from the inside, and completely abandoned. The group's belongings are still there. Their boots are still there. Their food is still there. And stretching out into the snow, footprints. 9 sets of them, leading away from the tent, down the mountain, into the dark. What happened next is so disturbing that Soviet investigators closed the case and buried it. And for 67 years, the world has been fed the same recycled theories: avalanche, infrasound, military testing. But I went back to the original files, the ones Russia didn't want you to read. And what I found changes everything you think you know about Dyatlov Pass. Stay with me, because this goes much deeper than any video has taken you before. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand who these 9 people were, because this is the detail that almost every video glosses over in 30 seconds, and it's the most important context of the entire case. These are not tourists. These are not beginners. These are not people who got lost. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, was 23 years old and already a legend at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He had designed his own heating equipment for expeditions. He had completed over a dozen Category 3 hikes, the highest difficulty rating in Soviet mountaineering. His peers described him as someone who was physically incapable of panic. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old, had completed more than a dozen major expeditions, known for staying calm in situations that broke other hikers. Rustam Slobodin, experienced enough that fellow students would follow him anywhere, physically one of the strongest members of the group. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko, both graduates, both experienced in winter survival, both trained to operate in exactly the kind of conditions they found themselves in that night. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest at 37, a World War II veteran, a man who had survived things that would make most people's nightmares look mild. And Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, already one of the most experienced female mountaineers at the university. These 9 people had a combined experience level that most professional guides today would envy. They had trained for the cold. They had trained for emergencies. They had gear rated for temperatures far below what that night was going to deliver. So when you hear what happened to them, when you see how they died, you need to hold on to this fact. The best of the best went up that mountain, and something on that mountain broke every single one of them. That is not an avalanche. January 23rd, 1959. The group departs from Sverdlovsk, heading toward Otorten Mountain, a Grade 3 winter route. Challenging, but well within their abilities. Their plan was to complete the route and return by February 12th. The early days of the journey went exactly as expected. Dyatlov sent back regular updates. The group was photographed laughing, eating, setting up camp with the efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. Their diaries from those first days read like a camping trip. Jokes between friends, complaints about the cold, the kind of camaraderie that only comes from people who completely trust each other. Then on February 1st, they made a decision. Bad weather had pushed them slightly off course. Instead of camping in the valley where they would have had protection from the wind, they set up their tent on the exposed slope of Kolitsyakhl, a name that, in the local Monsey language, translates to Dead Mountain. They chose the exposed slope deliberately. Dyatlov was an experienced enough leader to know that camping on the slope rather than below, it would save them time the next morning. It was a calculated decision, a logical one. It was the law. The logical thing that happened February 12th comes and goes. No word from Dyatlov. No return. By February 20th, search parties are dispatched. On February 26th, they find the tent. And what they find makes no sense. The tent is partially collapsed, but not from the outside. From inside, someone took a knife and slashed through the fabric at multiple points, creating openings large enough to crawl through. The cuts are clean, deliberate. made in a hurry. Everything inside is exactly as it should be. Food, clothing, boots, the group's personal diaries, cameras with film still inside. Nothing had been taken. Nothing was missing. Whatever made 9 experienced, rational mountaineers cut their way out of their tent and run into a blizzard, it did not give them time to put on their shoes. The footprints lead down the slope. 9 sets, walking at first, not running. And this detail is one that almost no video spends enough time on. They were walking, calmly, in a line, moving away from the tent in an organized fashion, which means whatever scared them out of that tent, they had enough composure to walk, not sprint. They made a decision together. They chose to leave, and then they kept going, down the slope, across a frozen creek, toward a tree line 1.5 kilometers away, in temperatures that night of minus 30 degrees Celsius. Without boots, without coats, without any of the gear that would have kept them alive. The first 2 bodies are found near the tree line. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They are found in their underwear. The branches above them are broken up to 5 meters high, evidence that they had climbed the tree, looking for something, or watching for something. A fire had been lit nearby. Small, not enough to keep them warm, but they lit it anyway, which means they were still thinking, still functioning, still trying to survive. Between the tree line and the tent, 3 more bodies are found. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova. They are positioned in a line, as if they had been trying to walk back to the tent, back towards safety. They died on the way, and then there were 4 still missing. It takes until May, when the snow finally melts, to find the last 4. They are discovered in a ravine, under 4 meters of snow, 75 meters deeper into the forest than the others. And this is where the case stops being a tragedy and becomes something else entirely. These 4, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibaut Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov, show injuries that the medical examiner describes in the official report as consistent with a car crash or a significant explosion. Not a fall, not frostbite, not an avalanche. Thibaut Brignol had a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs, bilateral fractures, meaning both sides simultaneously, caused by what the examiner concluded was an extraordinarily powerful compressive force, the kind of force that crushes a chest. But here is the detail that the official report buried in a footnote and that almost every YouTube video mentions for exactly 1 sentence before moving on. There was no external bruising, no cuts, no marks on the skin. Whatever caused those fractures hit them from the inside out, or from every direction at once. The Soviet examiner wrote that the force was comparable to a car accident, but with no visible external trauma. How do you break every rib in someone's chest without leaving a mark on their skin? And then there is Lyudmila Dubinina. Her tongue, along with parts of her lips and facial tissue, was missing. Gone. The official explanation was that it had decomposed or been eaten by animals or softened in the meltwater of the ravine. But the other soft tissue on her body was largely intact. Her tongue specifically gone, and Zolotaryov's eyes were missing too. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, wrote in his personal notes years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and he could finally speak, that he believed something extraordinary had happened on that mountain. Something he was told to stop investigating. He was told to close the case. The conclusion written into the official record? Death by an unknown compelling force. Think about that. The Soviet government, a government that had an answer for everything, a government built on the idea that the state was always in control, looked at what happened on Dyatlov Pass and officially wrote, "We don't know." When the clothing from 3 of the victims was tested, specifically Krivonischenko's clothing and items belonging to Dubinina and Zolotaryov, the test came back positive for abnormally high levels of radioactive contamination, beta radiation, on their clothes. The Soviet government's response was to classify that finding immediately. It was not included in the public version of the case. It was buried. And for decades, when this detail eventually surfaced, the explanation offered was simple. Some of the hikers worked in facilities that used radioactive materials. The contamination was from their workplace. It transferred to their clothes during the trip. Nothing unusual. Krivonischenko did work at a closed nuclear facility, Chelyabinsk 40, a plutonium production plant. This is a fact. But here is what nobody tells you. Chelyabinsk 40 had strict decontamination protocols. Workers were checked before leaving the facility. Contaminated clothing was not permitted to leave the site. The idea that Krivonischenko walked out of a Soviet nuclear facility with radioactive clothes, packed them for a hiking trip, and nobody noticed, that contradicts everything we know about how that facility operated. And Dubinina and Zolotaryov, they didn't work at nuclear facilities. So where did the contamination on their clothing come from? There are only a few ways beta radiation ends up on clothing in the middle of a mountain in 1959. A nuclear test, a radiological weapon, a classified military experiment, or a nuclear-power device of some kind in the vicinity. In 1959, the Soviet Union was conducting classified military tests in the Ural region. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical fact. The specific nature of those tests in that precise area, on that precise night, remains classified to this day. Lev Ivanov, the original investigator, said in a 1990 interview, after the Soviet Union fell, that he had observed glowing orbs in the sky above the Dyatlov area in the days following the incident. Reports from other hikers in the region at the same time corroborated this. He said he was ordered by senior KGB officials to exclude any mention of this from his report. He complied, because in 1959 Soviet Russia, you complied or you disappeared. 60 years after the incident, Russia officially reopened the Dyatlov Pass case. In 2019, the Russian prosecutor's office announced their conclusion after a new investigation. Avalanche, a small, localized avalanche, a slab avalanche specifically, had hit the tent in the night. This caused the group to cut their way out in a panic. The injuries were caused by the snow compression. The missing tongue was decomposition. The radiation was workplace contamination. Case closed. The true crime community and the scientific community pushed back immediately. The slope angle at the campsite is between 15 and 20 degrees. Slab avalanches require a minimum of 30 degrees to initiate. The snow at the site showed no evidence of avalanche debris when the search party arrived, and experienced search and rescue personnel were specifically asked about this. There was no disturbed snow field, no debris field. The tent itself was not buried. It was collapsed from inside cuts and partial snow accumulation, not from an avalanche impact. The injuries also don't fit. A slab avalanche compresses victims under snow. It does not produce the specific bilateral rib fractures and skull trauma seen on the four in the ravine, who were 75 meters deeper into the forest, well beyond where any avalanche from that slope would have reached. And the walking footprints. Organized. Calm. 9 sets, walking in a line. An avalanche does not give you time to calmly walk away in single file. You run. You scramble. You panic. Russia's 2019 answer was designed to close a file, not solve a case. So what had happened? Here is what the evidence, all of it, including what Russia buried, actually points to. Something woke those 9 people in the night. Something that was outside the tent. Not inside. Not an avalanche. Something that made them cut their way out rather than unzip the entrance, because unzipping would have meant opening the door toward whatever was out there. They exited through the cuts in the side of the tent and moved down the slope in an organized group. Walking, because they had a plan, get to the treeline, get shelter, wait for whatever it was to pass. These were experienced people. They were executing a survival strategy. At the treeline, they split. Some stayed to build a fire. Some tried to go back. The 4 who made it furthest into the forest, into the ravine, encountered something. Something that produced injuries consistent with an enormous concussive force. A pressure wave. The kind generated by an explosion, or by a classified military device being tested in the vicinity. The radiation on the clothing. The missing soft tissue. The crushed ribs with no external bruising. The classified files. The KGB involvement in shutting down the investigation. The glowing orbs reported by multiple witnesses, including the original investigator. This was not an avalanche. This was not infrasound. This was not a Yeti. This was a military incident. Something the Soviet government tested in that region on that night. Something that went wrong, or something that worked exactly as intended, and 9 civilians were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the Soviet state did what Soviet states do. They buried it, classified it, wrote unknown compelling force, and closed the door. The full files, the unredacted files, are still classified in Russia. In 2023, requests to access the complete Dyatlov investigation records were denied. Not because there is nothing there, because there is 9 of the most experienced hikers in Soviet history, dead on a mountain with broken ribs, no boots, and radiation on their clothes. Russia says it was an avalanche. The radiation says otherwise. The missing files say otherwise. And Lev Ivanov, the man who was actually there, who held those case files in his hands, who was ordered to stop asking questions, he said otherwise too, the moment he finally could. So I want to know what you think. Russia says avalanche. The evidence says military incident. Which detail in this case do you think they are most desperate to keep hidden? Drop it in the comments below. If this video gave you something the other 50 Dyatlov videos didn't, hit subscribe. Because this is what Behind the Case does. We go back to the original files. We read what they buried. And we don't stop at the official answer. The next case is already being researched. And trust me, it's worse than this one.